Okay, so this is a video on working out how to measure, make and sew lining for a crochet garment. The garment I'll be working on is my bodycon crochet skirt. So the things that you will need for this project are measuring tape, some pattern paper or any form of paper that you can make up your pattern piece onto, a ruler, or alternatively, if you have one, a Patternmaster, which I will be using, but a ruler is just fine. All you need is the straight edge, a pencil, a fabric marker, some fabric scissors, or alternatively, some rotary cutters. Please ensure that if you are going to use rotary cutters that you have a cutting mat. This protects your table from getting cut by the rotary cutter also. As well as your fabric scissors, you'll also need some paper scissors, some pins to pin your fabric in place, and or some Wonderweb. You don't need this, but this will make your life easier, but if you want to keep this low budget, don't worry about it. A needle for hand sewing, for attaching your lining to your crochet garment. Some thread, an iron and an ironing board to press your seams. So these next two tools are only for people who already own a sewing machine. You don't need a sewing machine to complete this project. I'm going to be doing most of this project by hand, and the bits that I am going to be doing by machine can easily be done by hand, so no need to worry. But if you do have a sewing machine, you might want to grab yourself some Superstretch needles, as well as a walking foot. This will just make your life so much easier when dealing with slippery fabrics. Another optional material that you might like to purchase is tissue paper. This will help stop the fabric sliding around when you are cutting it, and also when you are sewing it if you choose to sew it on a sewing machine. And finally, of course, you will need your crochet project or garment and your lining fabric. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that your crochet garment will have a 4-way stretch. It stretches horizontally and it stretches vertically. Therefore, you will need to purchase a fabric lining that also has a 4-way stretch. This is very important. If, for instance, you use 2-way stretch fabric instead, there will not be enough ease for the skirt to fit comfortably, or you will compensate by making the skirt lining larger than the actual crochet garment, resulting in lumps and bumps of excess fabric beneath your crochet garment. So the second step is to measure your crochet project to find how much fabric you will need for the lining. So I've opened up my skirt, and I'm also aware that my skirt is bunching here and here, so I will be adding a couple of centimetres on both sides to the measurement that I get. So I'm going to find the widest point across on my project, and I will note down that measurement. I will also add 1.5 centimetres to both sides for the seam allowance, so 3 centimetres in total. The next thing you're going to want to find is you're going to want to find the longest part of your garment or your project, and you're going to want to measure from the top to the bottom of that point. I'm also going to add a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the top. I will be adding 3 centimetres on the bottom for the hem. So step 3 is to source your lining fabric now that you know how much you'll need. Remembering that it should be a 4-way stretch. So if I demonstrate here, here's my fabric lining that I have chosen, and it stretches horizontally as well as vertically. It's a 4-way stretch fabric. I recommend a light jersey knit dress fabric. The fabric I have chosen is a single spun stretch jersey knit dress fabric in the colour beige. Another important thing I would recommend is when ordering your fabric, make sure you order more than you need. You can see here, I've probably got double of what I need, maybe not quite, almost double of what I need. This is in case things go wrong whilst you're sewing and you have fabric on hand and you don't have to run to the fabric store or order some more. So step 4 is to cut enough pattern paper or whatever paper you're using to fit your garment onto. Step 5 is to take your pencil and carefully trace around your project. I'm going to start by tracing the front 2 sides of my skirt. I'm going to start by tracing down the sides. I don't want my lining to be as long as my skirt, otherwise it will start to show on the outside. So I'm going to take my Patternmaster and mark where I want my lining to stop. I want my lining to stop somewhere between the last button and the button above it. So I'm going to go for around here and just mark that across. Make sure it's also, I have buttons on my skirt, so I don't want the lining to cover the button bands. So I will be stopping my lining just before the bands, so they don't interfere with the buttons. Okay. I've also decided that I will be attaching my lining just below the waistband, so as to not to thicken the waist area. It's just a personal preference, you don't have to do this, but also it hides the lining further. So step 6 is to remove your garment. The first thing you're going to do is to finish any lines that you need to finish. So for instance, I had to finish the hemline, I had to take that across. I also had to do the same for the top line and the side line. Step 7 is to add seam allowances. I'm also just going to be using one side so that when I cut my fabric, it will be identical on both sides. Okay, so I have my seam allowances all drawn in, 1.5 centimetres for the top, for the sides, and 3 centimetres for the hem. And I've also written on my pattern piece to cut 2. You want to take your paper scissors and you just want to cut out your pattern piece. So you want to repeat steps 4 to 7 for the back. I'm going to be having one big piece for the back because my lining fabric is very slippery, and so I don't want to cut it on the fold. I'm just going to again start my lining from the bottom of the waistband and draw around the skirt. And I will be using my front pattern piece to help me find where the back pattern piece should stop. So in order to get the same length on the back skirt as I have on the front skirt, I have simply measured the length of the skirt on the front piece within the seam allowance. So I'm not including the seam allowance when I'm taking the measurement for the length of the skirt. And I've measured 39 centimetres. So I've made sure that I've measured down, before I add my seam allowance, 39 centimetres for the length. And now I'm going to add the seam allowance. Okay, so you should now have both pattern pieces ready. And if you want to just double check that they match up, just simply place the front over the back and they should match up quite nicely. And flip it over and check the other side. The next thing to do is to pin your pattern pieces to the fabric and cut. Now for the front pattern piece, you'll want to cut one with front facing you, and then you'll want to flip it over and cut the other wrong side down. So one where the markings and writing is facing you, and the other face down. Okay, so you should have your fabric cut. A little tip as well, you might want to mark the top and the bottom of your pieces just so you don't get confused, as mine look quite similar, on the wrong side of the fabric. The next thing you want to do is you want to place the side seams right sides together, so the right side of the fabric together, and you just want to sew your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance on the side seams. You can do that by hand or by machine. The next thing to do is to press your seams open. If you're working with jersey fabric like I am, the seams will not behave very well after you've pressed them, but don't worry about it. I would also advise using some sort of cloth or pressing cloth if you have one in between your fabric and the iron, just to protect the fabric. Another thing you'll also want to do is to press all of the seam allowances, so the hem, the top and the sides. The next thing you want to do is to mitre all four corners. So a mitred corner looks like that. I will leave a link in the description box below to a video on how to mitre your corners. The next thing to do is to hem your lining. Once you've hemmed your lining, you will want to lay your crochet garment out. I'm going to attach my lining so that the wrong side of my lining is facing the wrong side of my skirt. So the inside of my skirt is the wrong side of my skirt. I want to attach the lining, like I said, just below the waistband. I also wanted to keep it inside the button band. It's fitting very nicely at the moment. The first thing I would recommend you do is to tack it in place if you feel like the lining is going to move around whilst you sew. So I have simply tacked in place the corners. If you want to, you can tack the whole length. You won't really need to tack the hem because we're not actually going to attach the hem to the crochet skirt, but maybe you want to put a few tacks in the middle, in between the corner tacks that I've done as well. I'm going to be attaching the lining to the crochet skirt by hand sewing. I will be attaching my lining to my crochet skirt using a slip stitch. I've linked a slip stitch tutorial below, so please click on that and check it out if you don't know how to sew a slip stitch by hand. What I'm going to show you now is what I do when I pull my needle through my crochet skirt. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to bring it through the middle of these crochet stitches. And what I mean by the middle is, I don't know if you can see, it's kind of sandwiched in between this side of the crochet stitch and the front side, so you cannot see the thread on the front side of the crochet skirt. And I'm going to pull that through, and I'm going to repeat that all along this side, the top and the opposite side, but I will not be doing the hem, as the hem does not need to be attached. And once you have unpicked your tacking stitches, you should have a nice lining. So let me know how it goes, guys, if you do decide to follow this tutorial, and any tips that you yourselves might have, stuff you would do differently as well, as this was my first time sewing a lining to a crochet garment.